Velma's first season was released in January of 2023 to near universal disdain from fans of the franchise and critics. Despite this, it was renewed for a second season before the first was even out. Now, a bit more than a year later, the second season has arrived, and honestly, it's pretty good. While there were many issues with the first season, including but not limited to the comedy, the characters, and the greater plot, there were three things it did well. The animation was high quality, with fun use of diverging art styles during the hallucination sequences, the background jokes were amusing, and the cast gave it their all. The second season takes all of this and wraps it up with an actual good script, seemingly taking all of the criticism of the first season in mind and working towards its strengths. That's not to say it's perfect, or the best Scooby-Doo media, but it's such a huge improvement over the previous attempt, which is what everyone should have been hoping for. This second season was inevitable, so there were two options: either decry its existence, write it off as a failed experiment and a travesty of the franchise, or give it a chance, acknowledge that there were positive elements to the first season, and if those were focused on, there could be something good and entertaining made. And frankly, they managed to succeed. It's not only the major problems with the season that have been dealt with, however, but minor ones as well. Initially, extreme violence was both a casual gag and a dramatic plot point, and the dissonance reduced the impact of both. Now they've ditched all of the random maulings and limbs flying off, and instead all of the murders are treated with weight. That's another thing. In the original, it turned out that no one actually died. All of the dead bodies with their brains removed had the owners go living on as brains in a jar. This time, people are actually dying. Then there were the strange choices like magical hypnotism and mystical therapy being central to several episodes. Those have all been ditched for the bad ideas they were. A few parts of the finale were even retconned for convenience. Shaggy was originally going to go to another school, and Velma and her mom were going to stay in her house, but, as those were both bad ideas, this season just pretends like they never happened. One of the biggest problems with the first season was the titular character, Velma. She was obnoxious, overly self-righteous, unfunny, and in general, abrasive. While some of those traits are still present, in general the edges have been filed off. In addition, in the first season every character in the main gang was in love with Velma at one point or another. That's been changed to only Daphne, which makes more sense and allows their relationship dynamics to be explored, instead of bouncing around different arcs. Her struggles this season are mostly around accepting other people for who they are, and believing in them. This goes hand in hand with her being in an actual relationship with Daphne, who is going through the typical high school drama of not knowing who she really is. Velma is also more competent this season, which is a huge plus. Incompetence can make for good humor, but not for the star of a detective show who is famously the brainy one of a group. Daphne has a similar arc to last season, but this time instead of embracing her criminal's parents' ways, she's turned to being a Wiccan. This allows for some discussions about secular versus supernatural, which is an arc used before in Scooby-Doo a few times, but specifically in the recent trilogy of The Curse of the 13th Ghost, Return to Zombie Island, and Happy Halloween. This combined with Fred's new and brief faith allows for some interesting moments. Daphne's introduction to the Wicca culture is through a new character, Amber, the child of Thorn, one of the original Hex Girls. People have been upset about this interpretation of the character, but the 90s were over 20 years ago. A goth kid in that kind of band could easily be in their 40s with a teenage kid. Time is scary, y'all, but it keeps moving forward. Amber is non-binary, but they don't make a big deal about it. It's always good to have representation, and the show is already fairly diverse racially. It's nice to have other queer identities in media. However, as a side character, they don't get much development or an arc. They exist mostly to make Velma jealous, and there's a brief diversion of Daphne cheating with them, but it turns out they were just casting a spell. Fred is significantly better written this season, while still maintaining the basic aspects of his personality that were previously established. He is still spoiled, childlike, and arrogant, but shows off more of his charisma and is a little bit less dumb. At the beginning of the season, he started his spooky stuff hunter business with a pair of dogs, and in turn has become religious as he goes along with the gig. While he eventually ditches being Catholic, exclusively due to the tithe, there are a lot of good jokes at the expense of the church. He also takes a lot more initiative, actively seeking out clues and occasionally accomplishing something. While he's still not particularly competent, there's enough there that he doesn't become annoying. Throughout the whole season, he reaffirms his belief in the supernatural, insisting for the majority of it that his mom was not a murderer and was possessed by a ghost. While this particular line does get a bit tired, overall they get a good amount of mileage from his fear of ghosts. Shaggy has a decent arc as well, taking on Velma's hallucinations from last year. Kind of. The cause of his, however, is not hypnotism, but PTSD from accidentally killing Fred's mom. This is an understandable response, and the hallucinations this time are particularly gnarly, with an impressive-looking version of Fred's mom with a gaping hole in the middle of her chest where the stalactite hit. For whatever reason, Gigi is much less of a character this season, but he gets another love interest in the form of Lola, one of the brains in a jar. Somehow after he lies to her and performs anxiety experiments, they become infatuated with one another. While the romantic arc is not terribly interesting, the season as a whole has much more stable relationships, with less drama and screen time. This means that while there are occasional conflicts, it allows for more exploration of other aspects of the characters. Shaggy, like the other characters, also takes more initiative, investigating mysteries on his own directive instead of just following Velma around. Having all the characters do this makes them feel more like a mystery-solving team, even if they don't quite join up all together yet. One of the weakest parts of the original season was the mystery. It was convoluted, hard to figure out ahead of time, and ultimately felt trivial as all of the supposed deaths were reversed. In this season, all of those complaints have been addressed. Every twist is suitable build-up, with at least a couple of clues sprinkled into the dialogue. Characters can be seen before they become important, which makes the world be more cohesive, and while the final antagonist is a bit out of left field, it still feels like it fits with the tone of the show, and what was hinted at previously. Without any further ado, let's get to the individual episodes. The series premiere begins with a quick recap of the events of last season, which obviates the need to watch it, which is a huge plus. Velma is then introduced through narration, and the show quickly jumps into teen relationship drama. While this could be frustrating, they make sure to weave some of the themes for the season in, making it serve a greater purpose. The ideas of trust and belief are in almost every episode. Velma asks Daphne to trust her in a relationship, Daphne asks Velma to believe in the concepts of soulmates and manifesting, Shaggy asks Fred to believe in him and his mother, and so on. In addition, there are all the supernatural elements, which come into direct conflict with Velma, the skeptic. Immediately after, it follows up on events that happened at the end of last season, namely the sheriff's death and the mysterious pentagram note that introduces Thorn and Ember. This sets up most of the players for the season and the main conflict, all in the first few minutes. There are a few decent cracks about Fred's turn to religion, and then we catch up with Shaggy. His hallucinations are kind of frightening and very effective. This episode also has by far the funniest. When he's driving, he sees Fred standing in the middle of the road.
Roarville, can we keep him? His name is my mom, because he's dead!
There's another retcon here, or at least a change in direction, with Shaggy choosing to abstain from the drugs that his father is pushing, and deal with his anxiety through science and reason. While this stoner Shaggy is the traditional adult way to do things, a subversion is more effective in a lot of ways, and how it's played in the season is a little bit more subtle than last. Similarly, while there is some meta humor in this season, it's much less abrasive. Fred comments that having dogs to help him solve mysteries as a gimmick is accurate. Scooby-Doo's original premise was just humans, but they wanted something to stand out. However, this feels more like a loving call-out rather than trashing the entire concept of the show. While there are no huge revelations in this episode, it has pretty good humor and a decent amount of plot. It's a very solid start, and shows off just how much effort the whole team has gone into improving the show for the best. Episode 2 has a bizarre premise that, even in context, doesn't really make sense. There's an annual tradition in Crystal Cove that high schoolers pair up and oil all the famously creaky doors of the town, and at the end a winner is declared for the couple who managed to oil the most hinges. It's mentioned in the background several times previous to this, and in this episode they even go into the history of it with some neat rubber hose era animation, but despite the excuses, it still makes absolutely no sense. However, this episode still progresses the plot along well, offers some decent character work, and a few solid jokes. The highlight is still Fred's religious references, including quoting Lands of Confusion by Genesis, rather than a Bible verse. Although Velma motoring away rather than dealing with an emotional conversation with Daphne is a good gag. The episode also features one of the better hallucinations at around the halfway point, as it morphs from just being the ghost of Fred's mom into an eldritch horror, with brainy tentacles, even drilling into Shaggy's eye and a nasty bit of gore. Animation allows for a lot of options that don't work in live action, and changing art styles is one of the most unique things to do, which is something this season does well. There are numerous instances of super detailed characters to display emotions or heighten a reaction, the flashback to the earlier time, and then the more horror-oriented sessions. There's further references to other animation with Daphne wearing an outfit reminiscent of Gwen's from the recent Spider-Verse films. In this episode there is also the morgue attendant, who was previously seen at the party in episode 1. He's hyper-detailed, resulting in a very creepy dissonance, reminiscent of Ren and Stimpy. He's also in a loving gay relationship, where he's open about his difficulties, which is again, nice representation. Of course both him and his partner immediately die, but at least they're relatively major minor characters. While there are lots of good moments, there are still issues. One of the biggest is the dialogue, which, while improved, can still be clunky and overly expositionary. There's no place for subtlety, with characters openly stating their intentions, opinions, and emotions. While this is typical of comedies, it can still be done in a better way. There's also the fates of the dead characters, who are said to be missing their dongs. This seems like it's going to be important, or even used for some kind of joke, but it's nothing more than the word dongs is funny. Once the killer is revealed, there's still no real reason for it. And having them just being mauled would make more sense. It's an odd choice, similar to some of the more abrasive humor in the first season. This episode also has Velma's mom and Fred's dad get together, a pairing that will surprisingly last the rest of the season. While initially it seems odd, Velma's mom seems overly flirtatious with a number of different characters, and after 3 years a hostage, it seems she's ready to jump into a relationship with anyone. The next couple episodes are largely inconsequential and feel more like filler material than anything else. The first is the science fair at the school, with Shaggy trying to fix his hallucinations, Daphne trying out manifestation, and Fred trying to figure out how toast is made. The best part of the episode is definitely the musical number introducing Velma to the Jones household, ending with the entire staff chanting, "You're poor," at her face, while showering her with expensive goods. That's exactly the right level of wackiness for the show, with just an ounce of satire or commentary. While nothing much actually happens in the episode, it's still fairly entertaining and moves at a good pace. There's a ton of background jokes as well, especially during the actual science fair itself, which is fun. The next episode, on the other hand, feels like a bit of a slog. It's basically a breakfast club with everyone stuck in detention, and it's just filled to the brim with meta references that don't really work. One or two could have been fine, but it feels repetitive and dull. Despite this, there are still a few things to comment on. Daphne wearing a dress that seems inspired by Midsummer is interesting, although it doesn't end up going anywhere. Gigi's father has Gigi's father on his uniform, which is helpful for anyone just barely paying attention. And while it's missing an actual punchline, Shaggy's dad's description of the common meme problems like being a brain in a jar or accidentally killing your friend's mom is a good gag. This episode does set up some of the backstory that will become relevant as Velma's dad, Amon, goes on a trip through memory lane. That does make the whole thing a bit less of a waste, but it's another 4 or so episodes before that really comes up, so it feels like the pacing could have been altered significantly, or even the season shortened by a couple of episodes. While most shows these days seem to have too few episodes, Velma goes in the opposite direction, and stretches what could have been shorter plot out unnecessarily. Episode 5 gets back on track with the main plot, as the bodies of the coroners are discovered. Velma naturally blames it on Amber, and there is a literal witch hunt. They use this framing device as an excuse for some decently competent commentary about the nature of social media, including their differing uses between adults and kids, grifters exploiting it for personal gain, and the power of negative reinforcement. The episode is relatively heavy on the themes, although Velma is never exactly subtle. There's some more class stuff, with rich people refusing to be told how to spend their money, and a short scene about guns in America. In the meantime, Shaggy and Daphne are progressing the main plot, learning that Shaggy's grandma is actually alive and has been continuing her research on brains for the last 30 years. While there's still some clumsy elements, it does retroactively improve some elements of the previous season, giving them more purpose. The episode also has some decent connections between Velma and her mom, some more obvious than others. There are 2 jump scares in the episode, one from each of them, and then in the end, they are tied up together to be buried alive for the consequences of their actions. The next episode continues the investigations into Project Scooby, exploring a military base. Before that, however, a setup is required, and in this case it's career day. While there are less background jokes than the science fair, there's still a few good ones. The episode also features the most foreshadowing of any of these, setting up a number of revelations that occur for the rest of the season. This includes Amon's backstory, Sophie's history, and some of the science of the brains. There's some decent character work as well, with Velma still trying to find her place in the world, and wondering whether she actually has a future solving mysteries. As always, there is commentary about whatever the current topic is, in this case the military, with their dwindling numbers, misuse of budget, and general incompetence taking center stage. The jokes here are generally weaker than the previous episodes, but it's still competent. Then there is a revelation, as the killer calls Fred, revealing themselves to be an elderly female. In response to this, the town does the only sensible things, and sends all the women into the mines for 48 hours. There are a few decent puns from the news, but otherwise it's some fairly general man versus woman comedy. While not much happens outside of the mines, there is some decent character stuff in there with both Velma and Daphne. Velma gets shit on by both her mom and Sophie, in a very deserved fashion. Overall, this season has been meaner to Velma, but in a way that feels earned. She is ultimately a selfish character who tries to push everyone to act in ways that benefit her, and work directly towards whatever mystery she's investigating. The world doesn't work that way, however, and the pushback she receives makes sense, and acts counter to some of the more everyone loves me stuff from the last season. Daphne, on the other hand, is on an internal journey, as she was stuck as a brain in a jar temporarily, made friends with a cult of cockroaches, and then blood got on her electronics, forcing her into a coma. It makes more sense than it sounds like. We get a brief appearance by her birth parents, as she's still trying to figure out who she really is. Then there's also the revelation that she did something with Amber, although the specifics are still to come. The end of the episode also pushes the mystery forward a good bit, revealing connections that all the dead men had and laying the seeds for the rest of the season. The next one starts as a fillerish episode, but quickly transforms into one of the longer exposition dumps of the season. But first we have to head to Sacramento, the butt of a dozen jokes. There's some good moments from Fred and Velma here that show them developing as characters and bearing more resemblance to their versions and other iterations of the franchise, with Fred leading a demonstration and Velma finally trusting Daphne, immediately after her admitting to cheating on Velma, which is in fact a lie. Does trusting a liar make you a better person? Maybe. After the majority of the trip to Sacramento plays out, however, there is time for Amon to reveal what he knows about Project Scooby and the killer. While there's some characters masked or in the shadows, it still helps to explain what's been happening and why the murders have been going on. Overall, this one is pretty average, very much a transition to the two-part finale. The finale itself, however, is actually pretty entertaining. It begins with the revelation that the super soldier meant to infiltrate the meddling kids is in fact Scrappy-Doo. During the first season, the writers explained they couldn't figure out a way to make a talking dog work in their show, thus the lack of Scooby. But apparently, they eventually figured it out. Scrappy has been a villain a few times before, with the live-action one being the most well-known, although his appearance in Scooby-Doo Apocalypse, a run of comics, seemed more responsible for his design here. Of course, while he initially appears to be the killer, he claims that he's being framed by the army, and it's really the government doing the killing. Despite this, Velma doesn't believe him, and immediately runs away, leading to a repeat of one of the best jokes of Season 1, her lack of physical fitness. There's also a solid Scooby-Doo walk cycle joke as the rest of the gang travels through the woods. Scrappy begs Velma to trust them, continuing on the themes of the season. Of course, in this case, the trust would be misplaced, as he almost immediately reveals himself to be the killer. But in many ways that still works. Trust is a two-way street, and it's important to put it into people who both deserve it and respond with the same level of respect. Daphne and Velma are still working on that, but there's at least progress being made. In addition to the whole talking dog thing, there's a lot more supernatural goings-on with Fred's dead mom. It turns out she's actually a ghost, not just a hallucination, and has been trying to make Fred into a leader. This involves a decent bit of body horror as she tries to possess Amber, and the demon that eventually drags her to hell is a solid design. The final episode of the season answers the burning question, with the identity of Uncle Scooby revealed to be Sophie. While at first this seems completely out of left field, there were actually a decent number of clues throughout the season. She briefly mentions she was in the military, the photos of research were in the restaurant, she wears white shoes, and when given the option to hurt people, she chooses not to. Her hiding her identity to have people take her seriously also plays into some of the wider social commentary. There's a brief bit with body switching in this episode, where Daphne and Velma learn how society treats them differently because of the way they look, and it's a basic if tired message. It also ties into how social media was used early in the season, and even last season, when Velma pretended to be a man. Thematically, Velma is actually pretty consistent and solid. While the overall motivation is a little weak, doing everything Scrappy asks out of concern for her loved ones, it's not too tenuous to break the suspension of disbelief. It's been mentioned a few times that she deeply cares for her family, including Velma, and will do anything to keep them safe. And speaking of Scrappy, now that he's been revealed to be a villain, he's able to create real havoc. Velma opts to stay, again demonstrating her character development, and tries to fight him off. It doesn't work, and she dies. Yep, Velma dies in the show named after her. Generally, the audiences seem pretty happy with this, even calling Scrappy a hero for finally ending the character. Honestly, I'm gonna have to disagree here. Velma has shown real growth, and was starting to become a decent and competent adult. Similarly, the writers have shown what they are capable of this season, which still maintains the same style of humor, themes, and messages as the previous, but in a way that is actually entertaining to watch and funny. Velma's second season is actually good. There's still problems with it, and the humor doesn't always land, the dialogue is a bit clunky, the overall pacing could use some work, but it is solidly entertaining. The animation is great, the character work is hugely improved, and overall it's everything I hoped they would do in making this season. Looking into the tier list, this deserves a spot at the top of the C tier. Now this does place it above the first season of Where Are You, which I'm sure will be controversial, but frankly I'd prefer to watch this season all the way through than that one. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I'm sure there's some strong opinions about the show and I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, be well.